Hello, my name is Albert P. Carpenter, and in this video I will be reading an article I have written entitled Eliminative and Multiplicative Materialism. In this article, Paul Churchland's thesis of eliminative materialism in the philosophy of mind will be introduced, analyzed, and discussed. This will lead to the identification of two theses embedded in one, eliminative and multiplicative materialism. These will be subsumed by Occam's sword. A second sense of eliminative and multiplicative materialism will be introduced based on the distinction between the quantitative and qualitative laws of matter and energy. These will also be subsumed by a second variant of Occam's sword. In conclusion, eliminative and multiplicative materialism will be presented as epistemological theses, with a metaphysical explanation to be found in the laws of matter and energy. Part 1. Eliminative Materialism in the Philosophy of Mind. It is not the purpose here to provide an overview of the origins or history of eliminative materialism, for those can be found at Wikipedia or the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Instead, I will state it as formulated by Paul Churchland and then analyze and discuss it. This will reveal two complementary theses, eliminative and multiplicative materialism. Further, the evidence in support of each will be provided and reevaluated. As espoused by Paul Churchland, eliminative materialism is the thesis that psychology is a theory of ours and others' mental phenomena, and one that is so flawed that it and its ontology of pain, joy, and fear, etc., will be replaced by completed neuroscience. Churchland, 1981. There are actually two theses embedded in eliminative materialism as stated above. The first is psychology will be eliminated, the negative thesis, and the second is that neuroscience will replace it, the positive thesis. The first is called eliminative materialism because it subtracts from scientific ontology by making discoveries of entities that do not exist. The second will be termed multiplicative materialism because it adds to scientific ontology by making discoveries in the neurosciences of entities that actually do exist. In a subsequent article, Paul and Patricia Churchland cite the following cases in support of eliminative materialism of other theoretical and ontological eliminations from the history of science. 1. The phlogiston and the phlogiston theory of combustion. 2. The caloric fluid and the caloric theory of heat. 3. The rotating crystal spheres of Ptolemaic astronomy. 4. The four humors of medieval medicine. 5. Vital spirits of pre-modern biology. And 6. The luminiferous aether of pre-Einsteinian mechanics, parenthetically electromagnetism, ? Churchland and Churchland, 1998. Each instance above constitutes a case of negative discovery, where, though never discerned with absolute certitude, we nonetheless in practice decide that entities do not exist. We found and determined that each entity in question above does not exist. Consider also the negative results of the Michelson-Morley experiment with regards to the aether. They were subsequently subtracted from the ontology of scientific discourse. Note also that this is an epistemological change, not an ontological one, in the sense that nothing is subtracted from the world. In an analogous way, there is as well considerable evidence from the history of science in support of multiplicative materialism. Consider the following discoveries. 1. The four moons of Jupiter by Galileo Galilei in 1610. 2. Microorganisms by Anton von Leeuwenhoek in 1675. 3. Uranus by Wilhelm Herschel in 1781. 4. X-rays by Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen in 1895. Electrons by J.J. Thomson in 1897. And DNA by Crick and Watson in 1953. Hellmans and Bunch, 1988. Each instance above constitutes a positive discovery, where it was found that an entity does exist. It was subsequently added to our collective scientific ontology. Here again, this is an epistemological change, not an ontological one, for nothing has been added to the world. Eliminative materialism in ontology and epistemology. While Paul Crutzen sees eliminative and multiplicative materialism as theses in the philosophy of mind, the evidence in their support suggests that they reach beyond that scope of that field and extend more generally into the relationship between epistemology and metaphysics. In both cases, eliminative multiplicative materialisms, nothing has been created or destroyed. Thus, they obey the conservation laws of matter and energy. There is, in this sense, a zero-sum ontological loss-gain in the above instances. This gives the erroneous impression that ontology is static. Part 2 will be concerned to provide evidence of ontological net gain, positive, and loss, negative, when the qualitative laws of matter and energy are applied to eliminative and multiplicative materialism. This will give rise to a dynamic ontology. The subsumption of eliminative and multiplicative materialism in the first sense. It is possible to bring eliminative and multiplicative materialism under two principles. 1. Unnecessary entities are to be eliminated. 2. Necessary entities are to be multiplied. The term necessity will be understood to mean not explanatory necessity in a theory, but rather as evidential necessity by discovery. Thus, entities are not to be necessarily eliminated for which there is no empirical evidence, and entities are to be necessarily multiplied for which there is empirical evidence. It will be noted that the formulation of these two principles is based on a rhetorical distinction between exhortation and dehortation. Therefore, the above principles are the exhortative version of the dehortative principles that 1. Entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity, and 2. Entities are not to be eliminated beyond necessity. These latter are readily identifiable as the first two principles of Occam's sword. Thus, Occam's sword, as a set of epistemological principles, subsumes eliminative and multiplicative materialism in the first sense. These principles could also be restated as entities are not to be multiplied for which there is no empirical evidence, and entities are not to be eliminated for which there is empirical evidence, or even entities are to be multiplied as they are discovered, and entities are to be eliminated as they are not discovered. Part 2. Eliminative and multiplicative materialism in the second sense. As stated above, and as thus far conceived, both eliminative and multiplicative materialism conform to the conservation laws of matter and energy in the quantitative sense. We will now consider cases where entities are created and destroyed. Ontology is not static. Consider the following list of entities. Dell Inspiron 1570, computer. Apple iOS, smartphone. Nissan Leaf, electric car. Susa sinensis, Indo-Pacific dolphin. Tododium testicum, bald cypress. Panthera pactuc, panther. These are all entities that exist now but did not at some time or other exist in the past. Now consider this list of entities. Tyrannosaurus rex, dinosaur. Pterodon stenbergi, pterodactyl. Utasaurus hatae, ichthyosaur. Elephantile biheron of Alexandria in approximately AD 100, steam power. Susong's cosmic engine built in Kafeng in AD 1090, water clock. Antikythera computer, 1st century BC. James and Thorpe, 1994. These are all examples of entities that existed in the past, but that now do not exist. In each instance above, there was a net gain loss to our ontology as matter and energy is transformed from one form into another. There are laws that explain this ontological dynamism. They are the qualitative laws of matter and energy. See also the qualitative and quantitative distinction in Nolan, 1997. 1. Matter and energy can be qualitatively created, and 2. Matter and energy can be qualitatively destroyed. Here, the term qualitative refers to the kinds and forms that matter and energy assumes as a function of its transformation. In this sense, while it is empirically verifiable that matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed quantitatively, it is equally empirically verifiable that matter and energy can be created and destroyed qualitatively. This gives rise to eliminative and multiplicative materialism in the second sense, in which entities are eliminated from the ontology of science as they are destroyed and multiplied as they are created. The subsumption of eliminative and multiplicative materialism in the second sense. As with the first sense of eliminative and multiplicative materialism, there are principles that subsume the second sense as well. The exhortative version is 1. One, entities are not to be multiplied as they are created. Entities are to be eliminated as they are destroyed. Or, in the dehortative version, entities are not to be delimitated that have not been destroyed. And 2, entities are not to be multiplied that have not been created. Conclusion. All the subsumptive principles stated above for both senses of eliminative and multiplicative materialism are epistemological principles, while the laws of matter and energy, both quantitative and qualitative, serve as their explanatory basis and are thus their ontological counterparts. It should be also stated that the second set of entities that have been discovered, i.e. the moons of Jupiter, etc., could just as easily have been incorporated into the latter list of entities that have been created through the processes of the transformation of matter and energy. This distinction is merely meant to be illustrative. Bibliography: Carpenter, Albert P., 2012, Eliminative and Multiplicative Materialism at WordPress.com. 2. Carpenter, Albert P., 2012, Occam's Sword at WordPress.com. Churchland, Paul, February 1981, Eliminative Materialism and the Propositional Attitudes, Journal of Philosophy, 78, pages 67 to 90. 3. Churchland, Patricia, and Paul Churchland, 1998, Intertheoretic Reduction, a Neuroscientist's Field Guide in, on the Contrary, Critical Essays, 1987 to 1997, the MIT Press, Cambridge. Hellmans, Alexander, and Brian Bunch, 1988, The Timetables of Science, Simon & Schuster, New York. James Peter and Nick Thorpe, 1994, Ancient Inventions, Ballantine Books, New York. Nolan, Daniel, 1997, Quantitative Parsimony, British Journal for the Philosophy of Science, 48, parenthetically 3, pages 329 to 343. This concludes my presentation of this article. I hope you have found it edifying. Thank you very much, and you can find a copy of this version, as I have said in the bibliography, at WordPress.com.